They financed railroads, steel, and oil. They funded wars, rebuilt nations, and later engineered the bailout era. One controls $3.9 trillion, the other advises presidents and kings. Their executives become lawmakers, and their rivals become clients. But when the rule makers and rule breakers share the same office, can the system still call itself free? Every story of power starts with hunger, not for food, but for control. Two men, two visions, and one idea that money could rule nations. Therefore, we begin in the late 1800s when New York smelled of smoke, steel, and risk. In 1869, Marcus Goldman, a German immigrant with $5,000 and a desk on Pine Street, started exchanging commercial paper. Across the same city, a young John Pierpont Morgan joined his father's London banking firm, building bridges between Europe's money and America's ambition. Both men worked during an age when railroads were the internet of their time. Whoever financed them ruled growth itself. Morgan saw chaos and decided to organize it. By the 1870s, he controlled the financing of entire railroad systems. Over 60,000 miles of track passed through his syndicates. He once told a partner, "A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Goldman, however, built trust through hustle. He married his daughter to Samuel Sachs, creating Goldman Sachs and Company, a family alliance that would become Wall Street's most flexible institution. By the 1890s, America's economy had grown faster than its gold supply. The U.S. Treasury faced collapse. Morgan personally stepped in, assembling a syndicate that loaned the government $62 million in gold, saving the dollar. Congress raged. Newspapers called him King Morgan. Yet the market bowed. That single act turned a private banker into a national savior. Goldman, meanwhile, pioneered new finance, the early version of IPOS, helping companies like Sears and Woolworth reach investors. The two men took different roads. Morgan ruled through monopoly, Goldman through networks. However, both had one thing in common. They saw finance as empire building. By 1900, their combined reach touched railroads, steel, oil, and trade. Every American paycheck, directly or indirectly, flowed through their circles. But power always needs more territory. The next chapter reveals how they began buying entire pieces of America. Not through wars or armies, but through ownership itself. Monopoly at a time. When money becomes power, control becomes strategy. By the start of the 1900s, J.P. Morgan had stopped acting like a banker and started behaving like an emperor. Therefore, while others built factories, he built systems that owned the factories. In 1901, Morgan pulled off something the world had never seen. He merged Andrew Carnegie's steel empire with several rivals, forming U.S. Steel, the first corporation in history valued at over $1 billion. That single deal gave him control of more capital than the U.S. government's yearly budget. Every bridge, rail, and ship built in America used his steel. When the press asked who owned the country, a senator joked, "Morgan does." Goldman Sachs took a different road. While Morgan created giants, Goldman financed the risers, new companies chasing the industrial boom. Goldman helped fund enterprise in retail, insurance, and transport. Their early bond issues turned small firms into national players. Therefore, while Morgan's power looked heavy, Goldman's moved quietly through paper and persuasion. Then came 1907, a year that changed everything. Panic hit Wall Street when banks overextended credit. Stocks crashed 50%, depositors lined up in fear, and the government froze. Morgan, now in his 70s, locked the doors of his library and forced bankers to cooperate. Within 48 hours, he organized private loans worth $25 million, personally deciding which banks survived. When the markets reopened, the nation realized something shocking. A single man had done the job of a central bank. That event led Congress to create the Federal Reserve in 1913, partly to ensure no one man could ever hold that power again. Yet the irony? The same bankers who inspired its creation helped design it. By 1912, Morgan's network controlled assets worth over $25 billion, nearly half of all industrial capital in America. Goldman's network, though smaller, had planted seeds across every new industry. However, every empire breeds rivals. As Morgan's structure hardened, a new generation of financiers learned from his methods but replaced control with influence. And as the 20th century opened, the next battlefield for power would not be factories or railroads. It would be the politics of war. Every empire eventually finds a battlefield. For J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, it wasn't fought with armies. It was fought with debt, gold, and trust. Therefore, when the 20th century turned dark with war, both houses saw opportunity in the smoke. In 1914, as World War I broke out, Britain faced a terrifying problem. It needed guns, ships, and supplies fast. The Bank of England couldn't move gold across oceans without risk, so they turned to an American banker they trusted more than most politicians, J.P. Morgan and Company. Within months, Morgan became the official financial agent for the British government, managing over $3 billion in allied purchases. Equal to more than $100 billion today, he financed munitions, steel, and even food, earning commissions that turned his firm into a global powerhouse. Across town, Goldman Sachs followed a different path. They didn't hold the purse of empires, they helped corporations grow behind the scenes. In the 1920s, they built investment trusts, early versions of modern mutual funds. At one point, Goldman's funds ballooned to $420 million, helping middle-class Americans invest for the first time. However, as the market overheated, speculation turned into madness. Morgan's world was built on discipline and control. Goldman's world was built on optimism. Therefore, when Wall Street reached its breaking point in 1929, both paid a price, but in very different ways. During the crash, Goldman's investment trusts collapsed, wiping out fortunes. The firm's reputation nearly died. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan's offices became a crisis command center. Bankers, regulators, and industrialists gathered there to stop the bleeding. Morgan's power seemed unshakable, yet the public began asking questions. Why should a private banker decide who survives a financial war? That suspicion turned into policy. Congress launched hearings. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 broke Morgan's empire apart, separating investment banking from commercial banking. But history has a sense of irony. The act created the space where Goldman would rise again. Therefore, while Morgan's name faded from politics, Goldman quietly learned how to blend finance with government, and the next era would prove that influence could be far stronger than control. Every great empire meets its storm. For Morgan and Goldman, that storm hit in 1929 when Wall Street came crashing down harder than anyone thought possible. The wealth that looked permanent vanished in days. Therefore, both banks faced a test that would decide who adapted and who drowned. The crash wiped out $30 billion in market value within a single week, equal to over $500 billion today. Panic filled the streets, and trust in bankers evaporated overnight. Goldman Sachs, which had been praised for helping ordinary Americans invest, became the villain. Its Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, a massive investment trust launched in 1928, collapsed within a year. Investors lost nearly everything. The company's name turned toxic, and for a while, people avoided it like fire. Morgan's world looked stronger on the surface, but behind the doors of 23 Wall Street, cracks spread fast. The hearings led by Senator Ferdinand Pecora in 1933 exposed how private bankers had influenced presidents, funded monopolies, and even avoided taxes through offshore tricks. One headline called Morgan Partners the nation's unofficial government. The outrage forced action. The Glass-Steagall Act split J.P. Morgan's empire in two: commercial banking under J.P. Morgan and Company, and investment banking reborn as Morgan Stanley. That separation reshaped finance for generations. Morgan's name lost some of its myth, but it survived. Which was more than most could say. Goldman Sachs, though smaller, learned faster. It rebuilt its reputation through research, advisory work, and slow trust building. Under Sidney Weinberg, the firm found a new formula: relationships. Weinberg became known as Mr. Wall Street, advising Roosevelt during the World War II and building direct ties between finance and government. That shift would become Goldman's secret weapon for the rest of the century. By the 1950s, both houses had reinvented their place in capitalism, one through structure, the other through influence. However, the next chapter of their story would take them beyond markets, into politics, war, and global coordination. Therefore, as industries rebuilt and economies expanded, the question changed again. Who really owned the future of the modern world? Every generation thinks it controls its banks, but in truth, the banks learn faster than the rules. By the 1990s, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs had grown from firms on Wall Street to silent players behind governments. Therefore, while politicians changed every few years, their advisors often came from the same offices. Goldman became known as the finishing school for world leaders. Robert Rubin, once co-chairman at Goldman, became U.S. Treasury Secretary in 1995. His deputy, Larry Summers, later took the same job. Across the Atlantic, Mario Draghi, another Goldman alumnus, led the European Central Bank. By the early 2000s, Goldman alumni sat in key positions in Washington, London, Rome, and Brussels. Their influence shaped global finance without a single vote cast. J.P. Morgan took a different role. It became the stabilizer of the system. During the 2008 financial crisis, when markets nearly collapsed, Morgan stepped in to buy Bear Stearns for $10 per share after it had traded at $170 just a year earlier. The deal, backed by the Federal Reserve, saved the financial system but also strengthened Morgan's dominance. Within a year, the firm handled over $2 trillion in client assets and became the largest bank in the United States. Goldman Sachs faced outrage. The Senate accused it of selling toxic mortgage securities while betting against them. The firm paid $5 billion in penalties, but finished the crisis stronger than before. In 2009, it posted $13.4 billion in profit during a recession. Therefore, the same event that wrecked ordinary investors turned into the biggest power upgrade in modern banking history. By the 2000s, both banks had moved beyond finance. They began influencing data, trade policy, and global markets directly. Goldman advised governments on debt restructuring from Greece to Argentina. J.P. Morgan worked with the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the IMF to coordinate monetary responses. However, once power goes unseen, it grows faster. The next transformation would take place not in boardrooms, but in servers, where money, data, and code start merging into one empire without borders. Power no longer needs marble offices or gold-plated doors. Today, it moves through cables, satellites, and algorithms. Therefore, when money became data, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs changed again, faster than anyone saw coming. By the 2020s, J.P. Morgan had grown into a machine of pure scale. The bank managed over $3.9 trillion in assets, handled payments in more than 100 currencies, and processed nearly $10 trillion in daily transactions. Its digital arm, Onyx, began building blockchain systems for central banks, while JPM Coin quietly replaced parts of the global payment network. The firm even advised governments on how to design digital currencies. Therefore, what started as a private bank had now become part of the world's digital infrastructure. Goldman Sachs took a different road. It turned data into power. Through partnerships with Apple, Amazon, and Stripe, it moved into everyday finance, credit cards, online banking, and payment systems. Goldman also built Marcus, its digital bank, gathering millions of users within 2 years. The firm then shifted into new frontiers: crypto custody, carbon trading, and artificial intelligence. Every new market looked like the old one in disguise. However, the more connected these systems became, the harder it became to see where private influence ended and public control began. During the pandemic, both banks helped distribute trillions in stimulus funds and corporate loans. The same institutions that designed financial policies also executed them. By 2023, analysts estimated that the top 5 U.S. banks, led by Morgan and Goldman, controlled over 45% of all American financial assets. Their reach no longer stopped at money. They financed green energy projects, defense contracts, and even climate data systems. Therefore, the line between finance, technology, and government slowly disappeared. Empires used to build cities and armies. These ones built networks and algorithms. And unlike kingdoms of the past, there is no flag to lower, no throne to fall. Because when power turns digital, it doesn't collapse, it updates. Every century hides the same few names behind its money. If you value truth more than comfort, subscribe and stay close. The next film reveals who writes tomorrow's financial rules.